Hey, peace and love. This is your brother Garfield, and this was a live supposed to be on Friday, but because of reasons beyond my control, I was unable to go live at that time. So what I'm gonna do is it's not a long live at all. It's a very short live, but it's about someone who I've studied a lot about. It's about Olaudah Equiano. And for those who know, it's about a man who claimed he was an Igbo, and it created a lot of controversy, but it had a lot to do with the abolition of slavery. So in the meantime, since I don't think a lot of people are specialists when it comes to Equiano or whatever, but do me a favor, family, share the show, like the show. I know how it is when I do a text blast. I mean, thousands of people are gonna get text blasts later on, and they're gonna watch the show. But I want folks to know that we're live, and I decided to go live because I don't see anybody that's live. And let me get the video clip. I'm actually supposed to be interviewing someone from Africa right now, but the person has not shown up at all. And we're supposed to be supporting our African brothers and sisters, but he actually never showed up. I'm not gonna call his name, but he actually got paid. But besides all of that, let's get this going, and please share the show, please like the show, and let people know that we're live, and we're gonna do this properly and let people know it is what it is. All right, at this point. All right, but Olaudah Equiano is very important because he's the reason why I'm in this country right now. All right, and yes, I did say 6 p.m., but I'm not doing anything now. I should have been doing an interview, and there's nothing I'm doing right now. So why not? All right. And this is a very good Lou is very funny. Is Yara gonna show up? So let me go to my Zoom recordings, and I'm gonna put this video on, and y'all check it out. It's a beautiful interview by somebody who has a lot of love for Equiano, a lot of love for Equiano, and I think we need to just hold on one second. Let me see if I got the audio and I got the video. So let me see which one I'm gonna open up first. And so we have 2 minutes. So Olaudah Equiano, for those who don't know, he's a gentleman who in the 1700s claimed he was kidnapped from Africa. It seems he might have been stretching his story a little bit. I'm not going to say he's lying, because out of respect of what he has done for me, I don't want to violate Olaudah Equiano. All right? I don't want to violate him. I don't want to speak about him in an ill manner. But I do want people to know what is out there and what is the actual truth. So bear with me for now, family. And shalom, family. And we're gonna look at the information, and then after that, we're gonna talk about it. All right. Love, peace, and hair grease. And I hope you guys enjoy this. This was a beautiful interview. Beautiful interview. All right. So check it out. Let me share my screen. Get him in here. Let me get me out of here. Let's go. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, this is Brother Garfield from the Brother Garfield podcast. Today we have a very, very important guest, Mr. Vincent Carretta, who has written a book years ago, the biography of a self-made man, Olaudah Equiano. And as the author of the book, I felt it was important to bring him on during the 20 for 20 project that we have annually in February to discuss this further, as far as Equiano is concerned, as far as information on both sides of the argument, and try to get some clarity on who Olaudah Equiano is. Mr. Carretta, could you introduce yourself to my audience and give them a little history of your background?
First of all, thank you for having me on. And I always like to have the chance to talk about one of my heroes, Equiano. I'm a professor emeritus of English at the University of Maryland, well, Maryland, as they say in England. And the last 3 decades, I've been working on authors of African descent, mainly pre-1800. So it's a lot of excavation work, identifying the texts, identifying the authors, trying to reconstruct lives.
Okay, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. What made you get it in? I know you're doing different projects. You currently just talk to me about the Phyllis Wheatley stuff. Who else are you working on as far as folks in the before the 1800s?
Who have I worked on?
Or who are you working on now or in the past?
Well, the ones I'm working on now is my revised edition of the biography Equiano came out last September or October. I have revised and updated biography of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. I'm now calling her Phyllis Wheatley Peters rather than simply Phyllis Wheatley, and that's a whole other subject. That biography is coming out in April, and along with it is my revised and updated edition of the writings of Phyllis Wheatley Peters with Oxford University Press.
Wow.
So that's coming out in April as well.
With Equiano, you said you had an edition last September. Is there anything major changes as far as you revising it based on the editions that you had before?
Well, the most significant change, I guess I'd say, is that we finally know where he was buried, which had always been a mystery. We don't have his gravesite because it's been paved over, but we know where it would have been.
Okay, that's interesting.
So and then there are some details, of course, that research never ends. So it's always best to correct yourself before someone else does it for you.
Right. What got you into studying Equiano himself? What got you into that?
It was a kind of mid-career, midlife crisis. I had been tenured I got tenure and promotion to a full professorship in 1990. And there are a couple of ways that you can go about pursuing your career. You can either do more of what you had done, or you can, which has a certain security but runs a risk of boredom, or you can try something you haven't tried, which is going to be excited, but it runs a risk of disaster if you're trying to look into something new. And at the University of Maryland, we have a fairly high percentage of students of African descent. And I was teaching British literature mainly. And we had always assumed any author of African descent writing in English was kind of by default African American. And so the Americanists claimed such writers, including Equiano. I had heard of Equiano. And in a local bookstore, I ran across a copy of an edition that Henry Louis Gates Jr. had edited called 4 Classic Slave Narratives. And the first one was by Equiano. And I looked at it, and I noticed that immediately he addresses the members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And it struck me that this didn't seem very American in terms of the identity that he was claiming.
Okay.
And I became really interested in, what was this? What was the identity of this author? The text was published after he had died, so it was a corrupt edition. There had been an editor in the 19th century who had corrected Equiano in his footnotes, and he was religiously correcting Equiano. He was saying, well, this is a bad, not a really Christian way of, not an orthodox way of looking at such and such and such and such. So whereas most people teach what they're researching, I decided to research what I was trying to teach.
Right.
And I discovered that in the University of Maryland's rare book room, which is not comparable to Yale or the British Library, we happened to have one of the, at that time, only 2 known copies of the 9th edition of Equiano's interesting narrative, the last edition that he published in his lifetime. And up until that point, until that discovery, everyone had assumed that he had published only 8 editions. And this is really important because Equiano was a great businessman as well as a great author. He never sold the copyright for his book. So all the profits were going into his pocket. So he did very well by doing very good. And the very good was the purposes for which he was writing. So that's how I came to work on Equiano. When Penguin Press used to go to all the major universities, they'd have a sales rep who would ask people, what do you think we should publish? What do you think people, students would be interested in? What would you assign to your courses? And I used to say, well, I think you should do this edition of this person named Equiano. I never offered to do it myself. This gets into a certain sensitive area because this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And I said to the editor, I'm not sure that you want me to do it. And he understood why I was saying that. And he said, well, how would you do it? And I told him, look, I've been spending years working on this guy. I'm really interested in him. It could be controversial because of some of the evidence I've found about his birthplace, et cetera. And the fact that he's been claimed by African Americanists, whereas he's really identifies himself as African British. And so he said, well, let's give it a shot. And I said, well, I can do it only if you agree to let me include everything I find, every textual change through all 9 editions, because he did make changes through all 9 editions, and because he controlled that text, and all of the notes that I want to have. And if you've seen the Penguin edition, someone once accused me of never having thought of an annotation I didn't want to include. And, it has hundreds and hundreds of textual and explanatory notes. And he said, well, we don't do that in Penguin Classics. I said, well, then I have no reason to do it. I said, I'm running a risk in doing it. You're only paying me $1,500 up front. I get no royalties. It's a flat fee. I said, I'm going to have to spend at least a year in the UK doing research. So, your $1,500 isn't going to cover a month. The cost. I said, so for me, it's got to be a labor of love. So why should I do it, any other way? And if you want somebody else, I can, suggest some people who could do it within your format and your limits. And he said, wow, you're really serious about this. I said, yeah, I've devoted a lot of time to this guy. And I think it ought to be done, as well as I could do it. And eventually he said, okay, let's go for it. Let's see what happens. And so that's how the Penguin edition came about. And then from the Penguin edition, it was a kind of natural step to try to write a biography. I'd never written a biography before, which has its own kinds of challenges. Mm-hmm. And so that's, and once I got the Equiano out, I said to them, and it was selling well for them. And as I say, it didn't make money for me, but made money for them, still does. I said, well, here are some other people I want to do. And they said, okay, so that was Kwabna Adaba Equiano followed, and Ignatius Sancho followed, and Phyllis Wheatley followed, additions all with a penguin. And, I was on the map then.
Let me ask you this. What's the, based on your research, what's the oldest records that we find of Equiano?
The oldest direct record of him?
Yes.
Would be the one that names him. And of course, his given name when he was enslaved was Gustavus Vasa. So the oldest record we have of his name would be in naval records of 1755. Because one of the godsends of doing work on Equiano, first of all, is the fact that his enslaved name was Gustavus Vasa, which is very unusual. So it was not that difficult to follow him. When you're writing a biography, it's like working on a ball of thread. You find the string, you pull it, and you can eventually get to the larger ball that way, but you have to find that first string. And so following his life from when he's in the Navy, owned by a lieutenant in the Navy, and the British, when I started working on Equiano and started looking at the records, I think of myself as having a mind of concrete, in that he's very circumstantial. He gives lots of dates and places and names, and no one had really followed up on that. And we could talk about why that is, why I think no one had really followed up on it, all of the information he gives. But once you start doing that, fortunately, the Navy, I assume that the British military in the 18th century was as anal or attentive as the military is today about record keeping.
Right.
Fortunately, they were. So if you can find, the first time he's on a ship, especially since you can find the person who enslaved him, and you follow his career, you can follow Gustavus Vasa's career. And so that's how it went. So from 1755, it's the first date as I recall it, you find his name in the record.
Okay. All right. So do you, what is your main arguments as far as evidence for him being born in the Americas?
There are two pieces of documentary evidence. One is the first one is his baptismal record, which was in Westminster Abbey. He was baptized in St. Margaret's, Westminster. If you're familiar with Westminster Abbey, there's a smaller church, much smaller church right next to it. That's St. Margaret's, which is part of Westminster Abbey. And he tells us in his biography, his autobiography, that is, his interesting narrative, that he was baptized in February of 1759. But nobody had ever bothered to look to check. But there's a record of his being baptized in February of 1759. And he's identified as being Gustavus Vasa, black, 12 years old, born in Carolina. And in the 18th century, in that period, Carolina included both North and South Carolina.
Right. Yeah, I'm actually showing it on the screen while you're.
Right, there he is.
So we could actually see the records, which
Mm-hmm.
actually has his name right here.
Right.
12 years old. But was he actually 12 years old at the time, or he's just saying that, or they assumed he was 12 years old?
Well, we don't know who gave them that information, whether it was Gustavus Vasa himself or uh, the person who had him baptized, who brought him to be baptized. He says in his autobiography that he was born in 1745. Now, of course, there were no birth certificates in Africa in 1745 in the area that he says he was from. So if he was 12 years old in 1759, he would have been born in 1747. But the second record that says that he was born in South Carolina, specifically South Carolina, was from 1773, and that gives his age as 28, which is consistent with a 1745
birthday. Mm-hmm. And that's when he was on pastoral. What's amazing about this second is that it actually matches with what he said in his actual book.
Right.
Pastoral, we could figure out the date and all that stuff. I think he said, this is actually a quote from his book, page 132, where he talks about the racehorse, and that's what he was on and so forth in 1773. And it actually matches with actual the records. So we can coordinate him on the muster roll of 1773. And of course, his name is actually a little different than Gustavo Vasa. Can you explain that to the audience?
Well, he's listed as Gustavus Weston on the muster list. Now, spellings were often off. In one of his earlier naval records, when he's enslaved, he's listed as Gustavus Worcester, or as spelled Worcester. They would have pronounced it Worcester. And so the purser who was responsible for all the expenses of food and clothing on the ship, he had to be careful about how many people he was spending money on, allotting goods to on the ship. He didn't want to be charged with corruption, but he wasn't as concerned with how they spelled the name. Now, a couple of people have said, since this person says he was born in South Carolina and he has the same age as Equiano, but his last name is different, then he wasn't Equiano, this is somebody else. And the problem with that argument is then they'd be accusing Equiano of having made up, having been on the ship, which would be a whole other problem, but they tend not to think about that. And his saying that he was on the ship is a lot easier to have, he could have proven that because the commander of the ship was one of the subscribers to his book. So,
I think also, you also documented the other two African men.
There are several. Yeah, there is someone who has sort of persistently tried to refute this evidence, and his name is Paul Lovejoy. And he initially said, the British would never identify someone as being born in Africa. And I said, well, the problem with that is records. I said, it is. There are several people on that ship on the muster list who have African birthplaces listed. Now, when the purser went along, and recorded the names of the people on the ship, the purser would ask, "Where were you born?" And you can make up any place you wanted. There were other people who were born in parts of North America, but Equiano's the only one who says South Carolina. So it's not as if that was a default place. to name. And there were several people who named African places.
Mm-hmm.
So he had the option. He could have, I mean, his life was one of reinvention. He could have reinvented himself at that point. He could have been a sort of George Santos.
That's a good one. That's a good one. That's a good one. Since you brought up Paul Lovejoy, and a lot of folks like to use Paul Lovejoy's information without doing the entire research. I like to look at both sides. What are some of the arguments that Paul Lovejoy has made over the years to combat your arguments of Equiano being born in America?
Well, of course, you should, I guess, let him speak for himself. But I tend to work inductively. In other words, okay, here are the facts that we can identify, or here's what Equiano says. Let's work from that and see if that holds up. Whereas Lovejoy tends to work deductively. For example, the 1745 birth date. That for me, that's the working hypothesis. You start from that, and then you look at what follows. What Lovejoy does, one of the things he does is, and I've pointed out that, and I'm not the first or only person to point it out, that given how young Equiano had to have been, if he's born in 1745, I have proven, and it's indisputable, that he arrived in England in December of 1754. And he arrived in England from Virginia. That's where Pascal purchased him.
Mm-hmm.
And so if he was born in 1745, when he arrived, and if he had been kidnapped in Africa, I've also, identified the ship that would have taken him to the Bahamas, as he says he was taken, and the other ship that would have taken him from there to Virginia. So what I did is I assumed, okay, let's see if he's correct. Can I, support that? But he would have been only, you have to allow the amount of time for him to have been captured in Africa, to have come across the Atlantic, to time in Virginia. So he would have been maybe 7 years old, 6, 7 years old. And everyone who has worked on an Africanist, in other words, African historians of Africa, have all pointed out, well, it's kind of problematic. He wouldn't have remembered all this stuff. He couldn't have remembered. He couldn't have experienced all this stuff in Africa. Yeah. So the first thing that Paul Lovejoy does is say, well, then he must have been born earlier. So there's his earlier birth year.
Okay.
It's just completely arbitrary. It's a back formation saying, well, I don't like the problem it would cause if we looked at the evidence we have. So we'll just change that early date. His most recent, we've played kind of a whack-a-mole over about 15 years, where Lovejoy would say, as I said before, well, they wouldn't have identified him as African on the muster list. And I say, okay, look at the muster list. And then, wow, they would. And so his most recent thing is about circumcision, that circumcision was not practiced in England in the 18th century. Equiano talks about circumcision in Africa, and he does not, he sees it as a positive thing. And so he could not have been circumcised, and this would have been, terrible, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's very important to look carefully at when Equiano talks about circumcision, and the context, and think about why he does it. He does not, whereas, yes, to say that 18th century Jews were not looked upon favorably, and so circumcision was not looked upon favorably in England in the 18th century. Absolutely true. However, what Equiano does is he's not talking about circumcision in England. He's talking about circumcision in Africa. And it's a part of his argument that the Africans are like the Israelites and that they practice circumcision. And the Africans, he says, are they are prepared for the Christian revelation. So they are like the Old Testament Hebrews. He's not comparing them to 18th century Jews.
Right.
And it's a very important distinction that about this issue of circumcision. So he can be very favorable, talk favorably or neutrally. It's neutral about circumcision. When he's talking about the Africans, he never addresses circumcision in the 18th century in England, out of Africa. So it's a significant religious point for him.
Wow. You know, speaking about Equiano and circumcision, he does point out something that's very unusual in his book about the color of the skin of the Igbo people now compared to when during the time of Abraham. And then he uses a couple of scholars to justify his arguments of why they are dark skinned now, portraying the patriarchs Abraham and them were actually lighter skin or white, but because they're in the sun in Africa, now that's why we're dark. And again, it goes back to your conversation about trying to compare them with the ancient Israelites instead of the modern day Jew. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, he's responding to what he's emphasizing is what's known as monogenesis, the notion that all humans come from the common source of Adam and Eve. We are more familiar with a concept that is rarely found in the 18th century, and that's polygenesis. That's a racist notion that really gets developed in the 19th century. It's very rare to run into that in the 18th century, in part because the Bible is such a strong influence in the 18th century. To argue polygenesis, that there are various branches of humankind, doesn't get supported in the Bible. So it's heretical. And so what Equiano is doing is trying to emphasize the monogenetic relationship between Europeans and Africans, that we're all one family. There is the human race, and we have certain differences in complexion, and they would call it, they usually use the term complexion. And in fact, they thought that complexion could be dependent on climate, that if someone who looked like me lived long enough in Africa, I would begin to have the complexion of other Africans. And of course, they didn't understand genetics. That wasn't, genetics wasn't understood, didn't begin to be understood until the 19th century. And in the 19th century, one of the reasons I like doing in the 18th century is the 19th century gets really nasty about race. In the 18th century, it's really quite different. People were not racist in the sense that they are in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, you'll find people who are arguing that there are different races and some are inferior to others, that are different species. even. You don't find that in the 18th century.
This is something that's controversial. Let me share my screen for a second. I look behind you, I see a portrait of Equiano, but these are two images that we normally see. I have the book in my background, and you have a picture over to your right over your shoulder. Which one of these portraits are the correct portraits for Equiano?
Well, it's the one on the left because he chooses it as his frontispiece. He hired the designer and the artist who engraved it, both of whom subscribed to his book. The one on the right was identified or suggested to be Equiano only in the 1950s. It doesn't look like, I mean, if you compare the two pictures, it's not, I don't think it's the same person. The reason it's on a poster behind me is because that was a poster that was used for an exhibit. It's not because I approve of it.
Okay. All right. What about the Passover? Did Equiano ever mention about they observing Passover in Igbo land? Did he ever mention that from what you have heard?
Not that I remember.
Okay, because I heard that claim recently by somebody from Igbo claimant. You know, he's of course claiming that they're Israelites or Jews also. So he claimed that in autobiography. I did a Google search on Google Books. I did a search. I have the actual PDF. I didn't see it. So I'm like, let me ask you today, because I've never seen that in all the works that I've seen for Equiano that he observed Passover.
Well, to observe Passover, he would have, in Africa, it would have had to mean that they were Israelites in Africa.
Yeah,
he's only drawing a comparison. He's not drawing an equation.
Right.
He's not saying we were Israelites. That's a whole different thing. This notion that there's a tribe of Israelites in Africa.
Right.
That's not something I deal with.
Right.
One doesn't deal with it.
What about the works of John? What's his name? Thomas Clarkson. What role did he play with Equiano and the whole storyline and putting his book out and all that stuff? What role did Thomas Clarkson play?
Well, Thomas Clarkson is the first great historian of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. And Clarkson subscribed to multiple copies of Equiano's interesting narrative from the first edition on. Clarkson wrote a letter of introduction for Equiano when Equiano went to Cambridge to sell his books in 1789, the trip during which he may well have met his future wife. And Clarkson corresponded with Equiano, but oddly enough, in Clarkson's famous history of the transatlantic, the abolition movement, Clarkson never mentions Equiano. He never gives him any credit for contribution to it. In fact, he doesn't give any credit to any person of African descent in the movement. And he has a chart, which I could show it to you. Can you hold on a second?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen. So Thomas Clarkson was an abolitionist, and he actually had a conversation with a gentleman. His name actually slips me right. Thomas Clarkson actually was challenged by another gentleman about presenting an African witness to the slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what's his
name? He has, I don't know how well you can see it, but he has this fold-out chart that shows all of these influences that are shown as streams going into the bay. And at the head of each of these streams is the name of a contributor. And, some of these are philosophers, some of these are authors of various kinds of texts, but none of them is a Black person.
Wow,
I never knew that. I think Equiano would feature on this chart, but he doesn't. And no one has ever been able to give me any kind of explanation as to why not. Why Clarkson racism? Because Clarkson was an important factor in his life. The other great abolitionist who is a major influence in Equiano's life was Granville Sharp.
Right. That's what I was trying to remember. Granville Sharp. What about Gilbert Franklin?
Well,
He was an apologist for the other side.
Right, he's an apologist for the other side who argues that he was one of the people who would argue that if the transatlantic slavery was so bad, how come we have nobody who complains about it? How come nobody writes about it? Ignoring the fact that, of course, most of the people who experienced it didn't have access to literacy, let alone to print. And that's one of the things that's so extraordinary about Equiano. And these apologists for the slave trade would describe the transatlantic slave trade as almost it was a kind of luxury cruise to a socialist paradise where you had all of your needs met and you had guaranteed employment in the West Indies. And you didn't have to pay for your passage from Africa.
Wow. When you look back at Equiano and him meeting his wife and all that stuff, and his wife was Susanna Cullen, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Where was she from?
She was from Solham in Cambridgeshire, and she was a white woman. And that was not a big deal in the 18th century. You had some people who would make complaints, but Equiano made a point of saying that he married this woman. It was covered in the newspapers, not in any negative way. In fact, Equiano, one of the things that people tend not to know about Equiano is before he publishes an interesting narrative, he was a book reviewer in the newspapers, and he reviewed both pro-slavery and anti-slavery books. And one of the books he reviewed was written by this man named James Tobin, who was a West Indian planter, who was a big supporter of slavery. And Equiano writes and says, well, first of all, he says, he implies that some of Tobin's offspring may look more like Equiano himself than like Tobin. And he says the answer to this, any kind of what we would call racial antagonism is intermarriage. And, he's saying this in response to Tobin's book, which I like to think Equiano was hoping he'd give Tobin fatal apoplexy by making these kinds of suggestions.
Right.
And Equiano pointed out that Moses had an African wife in the Old Testament.
Right.
So that, this is not, again, this is a sort of thing you wouldn't find in the 19th century.
Let me ask you this. In one of the chapters in his book, he said one of the things he regrets was when he helped a doctor friend of his, to go to the the Mosquito Island or whatever, to start a slave plantation, where he went to Jamaica and he got some of his brothers. He's claiming he got some Igbos and to go to this plantation to work. Do you think And this is before he's writing. I would assume before he's doing book reviews and all that stuff,
Right,
working on his doctor friend, and then he was captured by somebody else, and he was strung up. Do you think that played a role in him going back to the UK and being this strong abolitionist?
Well, that happens a few years later, that he becomes an abolitionist in print. It's an evolving position. It's another place where I and Paul Lovejoy tend to deviate, because Lovejoy, Equiano says that he left that plantation project. He was a free man at that point. And so he was supposed to be the overseer of the enslaved labor force. And as you point out, he was helping to purchase enslaved people to work on this plantation. And he tells us that it's because of, and this is after he had become a religious convert. And he tells us that the reason he left is because of the lack of religion of his fellow workers. He doesn't say it's because I was against slavery. Paul says, well, he must have been against slavery, and that must have been why he left. Well, again, I go by the evidence we have is what he tells us.
Right.
And I think one of the things Equiano was trying to do with his book is to use himself as a model for his audience, most of whom, of course, were white, because they were the ones who were literate, and most of whom he's writing for people in England who've never seen a population of enslaved people themselves. They've never personally encountered that. And so their attitude towards slavers is pretty much, I guess it's, I know it's there, but how bad can it be? I don't really have a position on it. I buy sugar and coffee, and we need the products. This is good, that sort of thing. So I don't really question it. So one of the things he does is he demonstrates the sort of gradual transition that he's hoping to have all of his readers make, from tacit acceptance of slavery to recognizing the evils of slavery, to turning against, at least initially, the transatlantic slave trade, and he hopes by a logical extension against the institution of slavery itself.
Right. Do you there was also a court case when he said he had to dress up like a white man and put on makeup for one of his friends that was in court. Can you elaborate on that situation where he had to dress up and make his skin white so he could appear as, the gentleman's lawyer or try to advocate for him?
Well, I think you're talking about for John, the Annis case.
Right.
His friend, where that's a case where he goes to Granville Sharp to get Granville Sharp's, to try to enlist Granville Sharp's aid in saving Annis, who was a cook on a ship, merchant ship that Equiano was also on. And this is again when he's free. And Annis has been kidnapped in England to be brought back to the West Indies, which was illegal after 1772. And they don't act in time. They can't act in time. They heard it out too late. And so they're not able to save Annis. He's brought to the West Indies, where he dies.
Wow. Let me go back one step. What you talked about, how Lovejoy said that because of the slavery, that's why he moved. But he was the one that actually helped the doctor to set up the plantation, in that sense. And in Equiano's words, are you saying that he said because they weren't religious enough? But what religion was he referring to at that point? Because that would be key. If he's quote unquote saying he's an Israelite, or if he's saying they're not Christian enough, what is he saying?
No, he's talking about his fellow white workers.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. I got you. Oh, so the white workers weren't religious enough. Wow.
Right. Equiano went through a phase that he recognized in retrospect was one of what we call self-righteous.
Mm-hmm.
That
That's kind of tough, though, seeing that he helped to set up a plantation. How righteous is he to do that? Put him in a position where he was. That's kind of like counterproductive to what he ultimately became as an abolitionist. Because if he's saying he was a slave, if he's being religious and personal, he would I wouldn't want anybody to be a slave, but he helped to set up a plantation. That's kind of, I don't get his motive at that point.
Well, where in the Old or New Testament is chattel slavery denounced?
It's not.
It's not. Right. So you could be a Christian, consider yourself a Christian, and justify it by saying, well, if we're exposing it, if enslavement is required to expose Africans to Christianity, they can ultimately, it enables them to ultimately have the opportunity to be saved for eternity. Mm-hmm. So that physical, and this is an argument you would hear, that physical enslavement in this life was the pathway for some people to a spiritual liberation after eternity.
Yeah. So sad. I think blessed are the poor in spirit, because they shall inherit the earth and all that.
Right. And Equiano ran into this in one of the book reviews that he wrote about for a book by a defrocked Catholic priest who used the Bible to justify slavery. And what Equiano argues is that, well, chattel slavery is against the spirit, even if it's not against the letter in the New Testament.
Interesting. Why do you think Equiano, if his name really was Equiano as he believes, or Olaudah Equiano, why didn't he use this name prior to a year or two before his book came out? Why didn't he use it before that?
Well, if it wasn't if it was a pen name that he used in the cause of arguing for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, it makes a lot of sense that he would invent an African identity. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the problems that people who say he had to have been born in Africa face. Why is this African identity only revealed when it has arguably a rhetorical motive behind the revelation?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I definitely think you have a strong argument. I actually side with you a lot as far as this is concerned. I think Equiano played a major role in the abolitionist movement, and I'm shocked. I didn't even know Thomas Clarkson, because I went to the UK a year ago, and a year and a half ago, and I actually took some images from one of the museums of Thomas Clarkson, complaining how he came over on a slave ship and he didn't like how the slaves were being treated, and he wanted to advocate for them. But to see that he never gave Equiano or any other African credit, that's kind of, it's not surprising, but I didn't expect that coming from him as someone who was a part of the abolitionist movement.
Well, I'll give you a little bit more about Clarkson and Equiano, or a comparison. One of the things that Clarkson did, as I'm sure you know, is Clarkson went around to the various slave ports, well, mainly Liverpool and Bristol. And he interviewed seamen who worked on the slave ships. He was trying to find out about the conditions on the slave ships. And he tells us that he was really scared, because people weren't welcoming this kind of investigation into what their livelihoods were. And so in 1793, Equiano went to Bristol, which was one of the two major ports from which the slave ships sailed from England to Africa. And before he went, he wrote a letter to Josiah Wedgwood of Wedgwood fame, China fame. And Wedgwood was one of his original subscribers and the supporter. He wrote to Wedgwood and said, can you give me some protection? Have you got anybody there who can vouch for me and protect me? Wedgwood didn't get the letter. He was out of town. He didn't get the letter until Equiano returned from Bristol. And he apologized. He said, I just got your letter. I'm sorry, I wasn't. But Equiano went to Bristol. A black man went to Bristol, and he published an edition, the 7th edition, in which he gathered Bristol subscribers. So imagine, here he is, a black man, going into the town that Thomas Clarkson, a white man, was really afraid to go in and ask, to challenge the main source of employment in the town, that which made everybody wealthy, who was wealthy in Bristol. And he's asking people to subscribe to his book and talking about slavery. Equiano also gave public talks against the slave trade. So he was someone who had the real courage of his convictions. I mean, he put his life on the line for this cause.
Yeah, I think that's the. I mean, talking about him, I understand, because I'm from Jamaica, and I recognize what he did for the fact of the slave trade and recognition for the abolition of slavery totally. But that doesn't take away the fact that most of the stuff that he said, he probably made up his whole if it helped to free the slaves or to stop slavery, it served a purpose. But on the other hand, he might have not been totally truthful of his entire life, his career in the world.
Well, of the things that we can, once he enters history, in other words, once he enters records, he is amazingly accurate. I mean, his memory is astounding.
Mm-hmm.
It's just those first few chapters in Africa that he doesn't give, he doesn't name his sister or his parents.
Yep. Very unusual. Very unusual. He talks about his father and getting scarification, which is a part of the Igbo culture, but he doesn't say their names, which I found very unusual for his sister or his brother or whatever. There's no names at all. And I'm like, wow, if you talk about your mom, at least you remember your mom's name. But to not mention them at all was kind of alarming. But what about the Igbos in the UK responding to him? Do we have records of them responding to him while the first edition came out?
No. The closer we come, he tells us that he interviewed people, and this is one of the sources of his information about Africa. And the whole notion of an Igbo identity, remember, is anachronistic. He essentially creates an Igbo nationality.
Mm-hmm.
And
can you elaborate on that? Because the audience might not pick up, because you said it slightly. Can you explain how anachronistic it is for him to talk about an Igbo or Igbo national in a nationalistic way?
Well, the award-winning 20th century author Achebe mentions that the idea, the concept of an Igbo nationality is really a 20th century notion. In the 18th century, Igbo usually meant people in the hill country, people inland, the people we don't know much about. And he is the first one who, rather than Europeans referring to Igbos, he's the first person who really kind of creates this notion of an Igbo nation, rather than groups of people who were, ethnically related, but there wasn't this concept of a nation in the way that he does. He creates it. And again, I think he does that because he's writing to an audience that has a notion of nation. Mm-hmm. And so they're going to see this as, more, he has to familiarize Africa to his English audience to have it, what he's trying to do work. So he does that on a national level, just as he does on a religious level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Moving forward, this is probably one of my final questions. Is there anything in the works to make Equiano's, the book, turn into a movie or anything that's in the works of that kind?
Not that I know of. I keep hearing rumors that someone's thinking. I don't understand why it hasn't happened. No, it may be. You'd have to choose, I suppose, which Equiano story you would want to film. In other words, to me, I think this question of the African or American identity, birth identity, is still, it may never be totally solved. I think one has to have an open mind about the evidence in which way, you go. But to have a film, you'd have to make a choice, I think. Well, I guess there are films, you can have alternative opportunities. But to me, if I were making the film, I guess, just in terms of narrative interest, I think it would probably be more interesting and compelling to have someone decide that an African identity is the one I need to have, and that he would create it because he would choose what you might call the larger T truth over the smaller T truth.
I get you on that one. Hey, listen, man, Mr. Carretta, I want to say thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule and meeting with me today and doing this nice interview. It's going to air tomorrow, and definitely you're going to get a good reception. People are going to have their little qualms, and whoever read Lovejoy's work might agree a little bit with some stuff he said. But based on what you have said, I am convinced. I mean, to each his own. I like to look at all sides of the conversation and what makes the most sense. And what you have been saying for years, to me, makes the most sense regarding Equiano. He did a great thing. He's a champion for the abolitionist movement. But hey, there's some stuff going on with the storyline that needs to be fact-checked and looked into. That's all. All right. Thank you for your time, my brother.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Hold a second. All right. There we go. Let's stop.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm gonna do is this. It was a very deep conversation. Yes, I left some stuff out, and there's some stuff that we should have discussed. But I'm going to go live on the after show, and then on the after show, we guys could jump on and we could talk about this. All right. So peace and love to everybody that's watching. Please jump on the after show. After the show, there's an after party, and one of the things, though, what was important is the whole anachronistic tone of being an Igbo. He spoke about it in a nationalistic sense, and that didn't exist during that time period. That's an ultimate dagger. That's a serious dagger, as a matter of fact. Jump on. The link is in the chat. Jump on right now. I'm about to start the other live show. Let me start it right now. So I'll be live right now in the after show. Jump on the after show. The link is in the chat. Jump on right now, ladies and gentlemen. And so we could talk about it. Everybody could jump in the chat and we could get it in. All right. Let me put the link. Kyle say, I'm first. All right. Peace and love to everybody that supports 20 for 20. Share the show. Tell 10 friends about the show. That's how we get a lot of views. Whoever watches the show, the 2,000 people, tell 10 people. That's 20,000. That's how you get views. All right. Y'all know it's some good information here. All right. All right. Peace and love, family. All right. Nah, well, it's just like an hour, so you ain't really missed that much. You could watch it over. All right. Peace and love, family. We're out. I'm on the after show. Peace.